Rocco Petrone walked into a meeting one day. He was the director of the Apollo program. It was under his wing. And at this meeting were about a dozen geologists and scientists, as well as Dave Scott, who would be commander of Apollo 15. Now, Petrone walked into the meeting and he said, "Gentlemen, we are not leaving this room or breaking for lunch until we agree on a landing site for Apollo 15. They had a deadlock between Marius Hills on the one hand and Hadley Rill in the Apennine Mountains on the other. They had been barking over this bone for 3 months. If they are going to launch in July, they would need to know that day. Otherwise they would blow the whole launch and have to wait for months until another lunar launch window became available. We've already had Apollo 18, 19 and 20 cancelled. If the program goes on any longer, there's a risk we could lose 16 and 17 as well. We need to know today." The problem between the two sites is that Hadley Rill, though is by far the more extraordinary landing site, which promises to unlock more answers and questions about how the moon came to be, what it is, but it's an extremely dangerous landing site with mountains over 18,000 feet tall. Trying to land amongst those peaks scared the hell out of a lot of the geologists in that room. Marius Hills was a lot safer a landing site, but it was basically exactly the same as Frau Moro geologically. There was not that much difference at all, and so the argument is, why go where we've already gone? It's the safer choice. We might do a little bit more exploration there, but there's no real point. So we decided that we would go to Hadley Rill instead, and it was Dave Scott who finally, after hours of talking at this meeting, said, "Well, the Hadley Rill has something that you haven't quite considered yet. Grandeur. And I, for one, think there's something to be said for exploring beautiful places. It's good for the spirit." For Hadley Rill, NASA would need to deploy its brand new and one of the most extraordinary vehicles that they had ever even conceived of. Hadley Rill is huge. It's an enormous, expansive site. So what did NASA do to make it possible for the astronauts to explore the whole area? They built a car for the moon, the LRV, or Lunar Rover. Before the car, we had an ability only to walk 300 or 400 yards away from the LEM. But with the car, we could cover a radius of about 5 miles, which dramatically increased the range of experiments and observations and just the amount we could see while we were on the moon. And this was brilliant for such an interesting site as Hadley Rill. Dave Scott, Jim Irwin and Al Worden launched from the Kennedy Space Center on July 26, 1971 to Hadley Apennine. And Dave Scott took control of their lunar module Falcon with Jim Irwin beside him in the lunar module pilot seat. And Dave Scott took the controls and flew Falcon right through a lunar valley in order to get to Hadley Rill. It was the only way to get to the site, was to fly right through this valley, trying hard to not hit the side of the mounds, but it was the only way to get there. Otherwise we'd be dropping straight down and you'd run out of fuel. Trying to land in between these mountains. And down they came into a perfect landing. And Dave Scott said, "Houston, the Falcon is on the plane at Hadley." And Then Dave Scott and Jim Irwin almost immediately started suiting up to perform a rather unique spacewalk, which we call a stand-up EVA. The lunar module has two hatches, one in the roof for docking and undocking with the command module. Apollo 15's command module was called Endeavour, and they left Al Worden and Endeavour in lunar orbit. The other hatch was for entrance and egress going onto the lunar surface. It was on the wall. And normally we go out in and out of that one. But Dave Scott did this stand-up EVA. He took the hatch out, stood up on Jim Irwin's shoulders, and just popped his head and shoulders out of the top of the lunar module and started surveying their site. Because it was the high point, the lunar module is quite tall. So he used this ability to stand up to get accurate pictures and just visualizations in his head of what the landing site was like and how they were going to get stuck into it so that they didn't have to waste any time with observations that they didn't have to do. So he was out there for about 40 minutes and then came back inside, and just a half hour later they stepped out on their first EVA. Their first order of business was to, of course, put up their flag and set up their TV cameras, but then to deploy the lunar rover. Now, when Scott went to deploy the lunar rover, they noticed that it had been damaged. Probably during launch, it had been damaged, and the front wheels, all four wheels on the lunar rover, are supposed to be able to turn to give it a lot better maneuverability than your average car. But the front wheels, the axle and front wheel, had been damaged, so they only had rear steering, but it still worked perfectly. And Dave just popped the thing on his own to see how fast it would go, and yeah, it did pretty good. And it was fun riding the rover, a lot of fun, bounced a lot, and it's a brilliant vehicle. And then they set off to their first set of details, a very special kind of rock they are looking for, called anorthosite. This is something that is very common on Earth, and if they find it, it could unlock a stack of mysteries about the moon. If they find it, they'll know that the moon used to be inside, used to be a part of the Earth, and could significantly narrow down the number of theories as to how the moon came to be. So this is what they're setting off to try and find, as well as just doing basic research into lunar geology. Because, like I said before, the moon is like a time machine. It's what the Earth once was, and it can take us back and tell us how our home used to be like so that we can better understand it today. So they drive off, and they get their lunar core sample, a big drill that they put into the Earth, into the moon, sorry, and on a couple of stations in, they put this drill in. They take their core and are ready to bring it out, and it comes out a little bit, and then it gets stuck. The drill won't budge. It's been caught on something. The rock's very hard, and so they can't get this drill. And so they try with all their might. Both astronauts, Scott and Irwin, try with all their might to pull this core sample out, and they just can't do it. And they're worried that things going to break, but it couldn't have happened at a worse time, because they're nearing the end of their EVA. They've been out for more than 6 hours. So they need to start thinking about getting back to Falcon and get in for the night. They have 2 more EVAs to follow. This is the first mission with 3 spacewalks. So they decide painfully, because they know now that they're going to miss some of their stations that they wanted to get to. They painfully have to just leave it, get back on the rover, and come back for it tomorrow. They might even have to blow the whole EVA on it. So they get in and repressurize Falcon and get out of their spacesuits, and Dave Scott looks over at Jim Irwin and he is as white as a sheet. He looks like death. And he says, "Whoa, what's wrong, Jimmy?" And only about an hour into their 7-hour EVA, doing hard physical labour on the moon, Jim Irwin's water line kinked up. So for more than 5 hours walking on the moon, Jim Irwin did not have a drop of water to drink. So he goes up to the lunar module and shoves this thing in his mouth and just drinks and drinks and drinks. And it's a foolish thing to do, because he should have said, right, I'm going to go and fix this. But again, he didn't want them blowing the EVA just on him. So admirable but foolish. So they go to sleep, they spend the night in Falcon, and they go out again, get back on the rover, and out they go and try to get this rock sampler again. Dave Scott says, "I hope that the freeze-dried spinach we had for breakfast will do us some good." And they start back out again and start to pull it, and they actually start making some progress. The thing budges, and then it budges again, and then they pull it out of the surface. After only about 5 minutes of working on it, they pull it out of the surface, and then they can continue on with their Grand Prix, because now they're going to drive up to the Rill itself. So they get back on the rover and start driving off to their station, and they drive up the Rill, up Hadley Rill, all the way up, and get off the rover again and survey the entire site from up high, and took some incredible photographs of the area, standing on top of this mountain looking over their landing site on the moon. And with another couple of stations, they head back to the LEM on their to go to sleep, to spend their last night on the moon before their EVA in the morning. They